in northern Minnesota, November 1936. While his neighbors were stacking firewood higher and boarding up drafty windows against the coming winter, 15-year-old Thomas Erickson was digging a hole that everyone agreed made him look either lazy or insane. The depression in the hillside behind the abandoned Lindquist homestead measured 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and dropped 8 feet into the red clay soil. Thomas had been at it for 6 weeks, hauling up bucket after bucket of earth with a salvage pulley system, his thin shoulders developing ropey muscle despite the meager diet of potatoes and whatever rabbits he could snare. The entrance faced south, angled at precisely 30 degrees from vertical, and the whole thing looked like a grave dug by someone who couldn't count. "Boy's building himself a fancy hole to die in," Martin Sorensen said at the Sunday social in New Uppsala's community hall, loud enough for everyone to hear. Sorensen owned the grain elevator and 300 acres of prime farmland, and his opinion carried weight among families still reeling from 7 years of economic collapse. Thinks he's smarter than folks who've survived Minnesota winters for 3 generations. But Thomas had no intention of freezing in some conventional tar paper shack that leaked heat faster than a man could split wood to feed it. He had spent 2 years learning from his mother's father, old Eric, before the pneumonia took him that previous March, and his grandfather had taught him that fighting a Minnesota winter with fire alone was like bailing a sinking boat. You could keep it up until your strength gave out, but you'd lose eventually. Before we continue with Thomas's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a 15-year-old orphan who survived the worst winter in Minnesota history by building something everyone said was impossible, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to Thomas's story. Thomas remembered the good years with startling clarity, though they felt like something that had happened to a different boy. Summer evenings in 1931, before the diphtheria came through, sitting on his grandfather's porch while the old man carved birch bark into intricate patterns and talked about the old country. Not Sweden, though they'd come from there eventually, but further north. Sapmi, his grandfather called it. The land where winter lasted 8 months and people had learned 10,000 years ago that you didn't survive cold by burning yourself out fighting it. You survived by working with the earth itself. "The ground, Tommy," old Eric would say in his thick accent, his knife peeling away thin curls of bark. "She holds the heat from summer deep down. Winter tries to freeze her, but she fights back from below. You understand? The frost, he can only go so deep. Below that, the earth, she stays warm. Not hot, but warm. 40 degrees, 45, all winter. You sleep in the earth's hand instead of on her face. Winter can't touch you the same way." His grandfather had survived winters in northern Scandinavia, where temperatures dropped to 40 below, and stayed there for months, where the sun disappeared entirely for weeks at a time. The Sami people, he explained, had built Gowati partially underground, using earth and sod as insulation, letting the ground's thermal mass do the work that would exhaust a man trying to keep a wooden shack warm with a wood stove. Then, 1932 came and took everything. First his mother to diphtheria in January, coughing until she couldn't breathe. The doctor, 70 miles away in Duluth, and the roads impassable. Then his father, 3 weeks later, the grief and the same disease working together. Thomas was 11 years old, standing beside 2 graves while the Lutheran minister read words that meant nothing. And old Eric's gnarled hand was the only thing keeping him upright. They'd placed Thomas with his mother's sister, Aunt Ingrid, and her husband, Harold Voss. Harold farmed 80 marginal acres and seemed to view Thomas as free labor that came with the inconvenience of an extra mouth. For 3 years, Thomas worked, mucking stalls, hauling water, splitting enough wood to heat the drafty farmhouse that Harold was too cheap to properly maintain. Ingrid wasn't cruel, just worn down to nothing by Harold's penny-pinching meanness and 5 failed pregnancies. She had nothing left to give a nephew. Thomas watched those 3 winters and learned that Harold burned through 4 cords of wood each winter, keeping the house barely tolerable, rising twice each night to feed the stove, exhausting himself and still losing heat through gaps in the walls you could slide a playing card through, Learned that the Johansons down the road lost their youngest to the cold when the fire went out during the night in February 1934. Learned that old Mrs. Peterson burned through her entire savings, paying for firewood, and still froze to death in her bed in March 1935, 63 years old, wrapped in every blanket she owned. The conventional wisdom said you needed a tight house, a good stove, and enough firewood to last the winter. But Thomas watched families work themselves ragged cutting and hauling wood, burning through money they didn't have, and still the cold found its way in. The harder they fought, the more exhausted they became, until some night the fire died down and the cold won. When old Eric passed in March 1935, he left Thomas a leather satchel containing his carving knife, a surveyor's compass from his railroad days, a small journal filled with diagrams and notes in Swedish and Sami, and $43 in bills hidden in a tobacco tin. Harold claimed the money was rightfully his for housing the boy. Thomas waited until Harold was drunk on Friday night, took the satchel and the money, and walked away from the Voss farm at 2 a.m. He was 14 years old, 5'6", and weighed maybe 110 pounds. He'd already scouted the location. The Lindquist place had been abandoned since 1933, the family given up, and moved to Minneapolis to look for factory work. 80 acres of marginal land with a collapsed barn and a house that had burned down the following winter, probably from a desperate squatter's careless fire. Nobody wanted it. The bank that held the note didn't bother trying to sell it. Thomas claimed a hillside near the southeast corner, far enough from the road that casual passersby wouldn't notice. Positioned where the slope faced south and a natural shelf of limestone ran through the ridge about 9 feet down. He spent April and May of 1935 just watching. Watched where the sun tracked across the sky, calculating angles. Watched where water flowed during the spring melt. Watched where the wind hit and where the ridge's shape deflected it. Watched deer trails to see where animals naturally sheltered. His grandfather's journal contained diagrams of sun angles and notes about thermal mass and descriptions of how the Sami had chosen sites for their winter dwellings, and Thomas read those pages until he could recite them from memory. If you want to find out how Thomas's buried chamber kept him comfortable at 68 degrees while his neighbors froze in homes that dropped below 40 despite burning through mountains of firewood, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what this 15-year-old orphan built would save 17 lives during the worst ice storm in Minnesota history and change how an entire county thought about surviving winter. By June 1935, Thomas began digging. The first 4 feet were relatively easy, topsoil and clay that came up heavy but manageable. He'd traded 2 weeks of labor to a salvage dealer in New Uppsala for a pulley system, a good shovel, and 3 sturdy buckets. Each day he filled buckets and hauled them up, spreading the excavated earth along the hillside's contour to create a gradual slope above where his roof would eventually sit. The conventional approach to building in Minnesota meant constructing above ground, a wooden frame, board walls, tar paper or siding if you could afford it, shingles or tin for the roof. The problem was basic physics. Wood is a decent insulator, but it's thin. A 6-inch wall might give you an R value of about 7, meaning heat escaped through it at a rate that required constant fire to compensate. The more surface area you exposed to cold air, the more heat you lost. A 12 by 16 foot cabin had over 500 square feet of walls and ceiling exposed to winter. Every square foot leaked precious warmth. Thomas's approach eliminated most of that exposed surface area. 3 walls would be earth, not earth against wood, but earth against stone, with the dwelling actually carved into the hillside. Only the south-facing entrance wall would be exposed, and that would be designed to capture every possible photon of winter sun. At 8 feet down, Thomas hit the limestone shelf his grandfather's surveying eye had helped him predict. The stone ran horizontally through the hillside, a natural floor that would never frost heave or settle. He cleared it carefully, using a borrowed pickaxe to level the high spots, and ended up with a chamber measuring 12 feet wide, 16 feet long, and 7 feet high. 96 square feet of living space carved into the earth itself. The skeptics arrived in July, led by Martin Sorensen and his eldest son, Carl. They stood at the edge of Thomas's excavation, looking down at the boy covered in red clay mud, and laughed. "Son," Sorensen called down, his voice carrying that particular tone adults used when explaining obvious things to stupid children. "You're building yourself a root cellar to live in. You understand that, right? Come January, you'll either freeze or suffocate. Probably both." Thomas climbed out of the pit, his hands blistered despite the cloth wrappings, and faced the grain elevator owner with the kind of calm that confused people who expected defensive anger. "The Earth 50 feet down stays at about 45 degrees year-round, Mr. Sorensen. The frost line in this region goes down to about 5 feet in a normal winter. I'm below that. The ground around me will stay above freezing all winter, and the stone under me won't conduct cold the way wood flooring does. The thermal mass alone will stabilize my temperature." Sorensen looked at his son and smirked. "Thermal mass? Boy's been reading books and thinks he understands winter. Carl, you remember the Johansson's youngest? They had a house, a real house with a wood stove, and that little girl still froze. And this fool thinks he'll stay warm in a hole with... What exactly are you planning to heat it with?" "I'll use fire when I need it," Thomas said. "But the structure will maintain 50 to 60 degrees with minimal heating because it's not fighting the cold. It's insulated by 8 feet of earth on 3 sides and above. Earth that holds residual heat from summer and doesn't let winter's cold penetrate. I only have to heat the interior air and maintain what the ground gives me for free." Carl Sorensen shook his head. "Pa, we're wasting time. Let the kid learn the hard way. We'll find him in the spring, frozen solid with his books and his thermal mass." Sorensen delivered his verdict with the confidence of 3 generations of Minnesota survival. "We've been building wooden houses and heating them with wood stoves for 100 years in this territory. That's what works. Not because we're stupid, but because that's what you do. You want to play caveman? That's your funeral, literally. I give you until Christmas before you come crawling to town, begging for shelter, assuming you don't die first." They walked away, and Thomas climbed back into his hole and continued working. By August, he had framed the entrance wall using lumber salvage from the Lindquist's collapsed barn. The wall slanted back at 15 degrees from vertical, maximizing the winter sun's ability to hit the surface while minimizing the north wind's direct impact. He set a door frame for a solid oak door he'd traded 3 weeks of harvest labor to obtain, and created a window opening that would hold 2 layers of salvage glass with a 3-inch air gap between them. Primitive double-pane insulation. The roof structure required the most careful engineering. Thomas laid pine logs across the chamber's width, each one notched to sit firmly in grooves he'd chiseled into the limestone walls. The logs were 8 inches in diameter, strong enough to carry significant weight, and he positioned them every 18 inches. Across these he laid a lattice of smaller branches, then a sheet of salvage tin from the barn's roof, then birch bark in overlapping layers to shed water. Then came the critical layer, 12 inches of compacted clay and earth, tamped down until it formed a solid mass. 12 inches of earth has an R value of about 15, more than double what a conventional wooden ceiling provided. On top of that, he planted sod, transplanting native grasses that would root and create a living roof that would hold the soil against erosion. The whole structure disappeared into the hillside. From 30 yards away, it looked like a natural slope, with a strange door emerging from the earth. The heating system was where Thomas's grandfather's knowledge became crucial. Inside the chamber, against the back wall, Thomas built a masonry heater, using stones from the creek bed and clay from his excavation. The design was Finnish, a massive, complex structure that burned wood hot and fast, capturing the heat in the tons of masonry that would radiate warmth for 12 to 24 hours from a single firing. Conventional wood stoves worked by burning wood and heating air, but they were terribly inefficient. You had to feed them constantly, and the heat went up the chimney almost as fast as you produced it. A masonry heater worked on a different principle. You burned a small amount of wood very hot, hot enough to achieve complete combustion with minimal smoke, and the exhaust gases traveled through a maze of channels inside the stone structure, transferring heat to the thermal mass before exiting through the chimney. The stones, weighing over 2,000 pounds, would absorb that heat and release it slowly over the next day. Thomas constructed the firebox with a vertical burn chamber, then built serpentine channels that forced the hot gases to travel up and down through the masonry 3 times before exiting. The exterior surface area was enormous, nearly 60 square feet of stone, that would radiate gentle warmth at about 120 degrees, comfortable to touch, but constant. He built it in September, working from diagrams in his grandfather's journal and from memory of a similar structure he'd seen once in old Eric's friend's workshop. The chimney exited through the roof at the back of the chamber, disguised by a cap that made it look like a natural rock outcrop from a distance. The first test came on a cold night in late September, when the temperature dropped to 38 degrees. Thomas loaded the firebox with kindling and small split logs, no more than 15 pounds of wood total, and lit it. The fire burned hot and fast, flames roaring up the vertical chamber with almost no visible smoke once it got going. 45 minutes later, the wood was consumed and the stones were hot to the touch. Inside his chamber, with the door closed, the temperature was 54 degrees when he lit the fire. 6 hours later, it had climbed to 67 degrees. 12 hours later, it was still 65 degrees, and the stones were warm against his palm. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 33 degrees. He'd burned 15 pounds of wood and maintained comfortable warmth for over 12 hours. A conventional cabin the same size would have burned 30 to 40 pounds of wood in the same period and still struggled to stay above 50 degrees. Thomas kept careful records in a ledger book he'd bought with some of his dwindling money: date, outside temperature, inside temperature before heating, wood burned, inside temperature 6 hours after, 12 hours after. The data began to tell a story that would matter later. Through October, word of Thomas's strange earth shelter spread through the rural community. In that way, news travels when there's not much to talk about. Most of the commentary was dismissive. The crazy Erickson kid living in a hole probably wouldn't last the winter. But a few people came to look, drawn by curiosity or boredom or genuine interest. Martin Sorensen came back in early November with 3 of his friends from the township board, men with opinions about zoning and proper structures. They stood outside Thomas's door, trying to find official reasons to condemn the dwelling, and eventually gave up because there were no regulations about what constituted a legal residence in rural Clearwater County in 1936. You could live in a tent if you were fool enough. "Mark my words," Sorensen announced as they prepared to leave. "When the real cold comes, and it's coming, Almanac says this will be a hard winter. That hole will become a tomb. Underground, no way to see danger coming. One good snow, and the boy suffocates when his chimney gets blocked. We'll be digging out his corpse in March." Thomas, standing in his doorway, simply nodded. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Sorensen. I've designed the chimney to prevent blockage, and I can dig out the entrance if needed, but I understand you're skeptical. All I ask is that you remember the temperature data if we both survived a spring." A different visitor came in late November, 2 weeks before the storm. Anna Bergstrom was 17, daughter of a farmer whose place bordered the Lindquist property to the west. She approached on foot, carrying a basket, and knocked on Thomas's door with actual politeness. "I brought bread," she said when he answered. "Mama sent me. She said anyone stubborn enough to build their own place deserves a decent meal now and then." Thomas invited her in, suddenly self-conscious about the Spartan interior, his bedroll on the stone floor, the small table and chair he'd built from barnwood, the shelves holding his few possessions, and his growing library of salvaged books. But Anna looked around with genuine interest rather than judgment. "It's warmer than I expected," she said, setting the basket on the table. "How warm is it in here?" "About 58 degrees right now. I haven't fired the heater yet today. Outside is 32. She touched the back wall, feeling the slight warmth radiating from the earth. "That's the ground?" 8 feet of soil between me and the outside air. It's like being wrapped in a blanket that never gets cold." Anna asked questions, intelligent ones about water drainage and air circulation and how he cooked. Thomas found himself explaining the principles his grandfather had taught him, how ancient peoples across the northern world had understood that the earth itself was a resource, not just a foundation. She listened without the patronizing skepticism he had grown used to. "My father thinks you're crazy," she said as she prepared to leave. "But he also said you might be the only person around here who actually thought about winter instead of just cursing at it. He said that counts for something." Thomas watched her walk back across the brown November landscape and felt, for the first time in months, slightly less alone. December arrived with unusual warmth. The first 2 weeks saw temperatures in the high 30s and low 40s. and the skeptics took this as confirmation that Thomas's elaborate earth shelter was unnecessary. Why go to all that effort when the winter was going to be mild? Thomas kept splitting the small amount of wood he'd need and stocking his root cellar alcove, a side chamber he'd carved for cold storage, with potatoes, carrots, and dried beans he'd bought with money earned from odd jobs throughout the fall. He'd hauled water from the creek a quarter-mile away every day, filling the 5-gallon crock he kept inside. He'd patched every gap in his entrance wall with moss and clay. He'd cleaned his chimney and checked the masonry heater for cracks. His grandfather's journal had a page of notes about the winter of 1888, when a warm December had lulled the Dakota Territory into complacency before a blizzard that killed over 200 people. Old Eric had written in the margin, "Winter is a hunter. She waits for you to relax." On December 18th, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees. On December 19th, it dropped to 8 degrees. On December 20th, the ice storm arrived. It started as rain in the early morning, freezing rain that coated every surface in crystal and made the rural roads impassable in hours. By noon, it had transitioned to sleet, then to snow, then to a howling combination of all three driven by winds that came screaming down from Canada at 40 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to 0 by evening. By midnight, 10 below. By dawn on December 21st, it was 20 below 0, and the storm was intensifying rather than passing through. In New Uppsala and scattered across the surrounding farms, families burned through firewood at catastrophic rates. The Sorensens went through a quarter cord in the first day, just keeping their large farmhouse above 40 degrees. Martin Sorensen himself stood in front of his fireplace feeding logs into the flames every 20 minutes, while his wife stuffed rags into the gaps around the windows, and his children huddled under blankets and still shivered. The Johansons, who'd lost their youngest daughter 2 years earlier, ran out of cut wood on the second day and started burning furniture. The Petersons, old Mrs. Peterson's son's family, nearly burned down their house when creosote in their chimney ignited, and only a desperate climb onto an icy roof by 2 of the older boys saved them. In town, the Methodist church opened as a warming shelter, but keeping it heated required burning through the church's entire winter coal supply in 5 days. Families slept on pews, pressed together for warmth, while the pastor and the township board tried to organize woodcutting parties that couldn't operate because the cold was literally dangerous to work in for more than a few minutes at a time. On December 23rd, the temperature hit 30 below. On Christmas Eve, it reached 33 below. On Christmas Day, the thermometer at the grain elevator registered 35 below 0, and the wind chill drove the effective temperature down to a level where exposed skin froze in under 2 minutes. 9 people died in Clearwater County during those first 6 days. 2 elderly men, 1 woman, 3 children, and 3 adults who'd tried to walk for help and hadn't made it. The county sheriff would file the reports later, but everyone who survived knew the names. On December 26th, when the storm had been raging for 6 days and the temperature had not climbed above 20 below in 72 hours, Anna Bergstrom convinced her father to let her check on Thomas Eriksson. She argued that someone should at least verify if he was dead, that leaving a body until spring was inhumane. Her father, Hans, agreed to take her on the sled, pulled by their 2 draft horses, though he told her plainly that they were going to find a corpse. The journey from the Bergstrom farm to the Lindquist property was only 3 miles, but it took nearly 2 hours. The horses struggled through drifts, and the wind cut through every layer of clothing. Anna wrapped her face in wool scarves and still felt the cold burning her cheeks. Her father kept stopping to check for frostbite, his face grim with the knowledge that this was borderline insane, but that his daughter had inherited his own stubborn streak. They expected to find the entrance buried under snow, expected silence and stillness, and the grim task of digging out a frozen boy's body sometime in the spring. Instead, as they crested the final rise, they saw the door, clear of snow, a small drift to one side showing evidence of recent shoveling, and, impossibly, a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney at the back of the hillside. Hans Bergstrom pulled the sled to a stop and stared. Anna climbed down and approached the door, her heart hammering with something between hope and disbelief. She knocked. For a long moment, nothing. Then the door opened. Thomas Eriksson stood in the doorway wearing a wool shirt and canvas pants. Not bulky layers, not wrapped in blankets, not shivering. He looked surprised to see visitors and then concerned. "Anna, Mr. Bergstrom, what's wrong? Is someone hurt?" Anna couldn't speak. Behind Thomas, she could see the interior of his earth shelter, the golden light from a small oil lamp, the walls that seemed to radiate solidity, the complete absence of the desperate cold that had dominated her existence for 6 days. "Can we come in?" her father asked, his voice rough from cold. "Just for a moment." Thomas stepped back, and they entered. The door closed behind them, and Anna felt the cold release its grip like something physical letting go. The chamber was warm, not just tolerable, not just better than outside, but genuinely warm. She pulled off her outer mittens and felt her fingers tingle as blood flow returned. "What temperature is it in here?" Hans asked, his words sharp with something that might have been anger or awe or both. Thomas glanced at a thermometer hanging on the wall. 68 degrees. I fired the heater last night around 8, used maybe 20 pounds of wood. It'll stay comfortable until tomorrow morning. 68 degrees, Hans repeated. He walked to the back wall and placed his palm flat against the stone. "Your walls are warm." "The masonry heater," Thomas explained, pointing to the stone structure against the back wall. "It burns wood very hot for a short time, captures the heat in the stone, then radiates it slowly. The thermal mass of the structure stabilizes everything, and the earth around me is holding at about 45 degrees. So I'm not fighting the cold from scratch. I'm just adding enough heat to bridge the gap." Anna moved to the thermometer and verified the reading herself. 68 degrees. Outside, it was 35 below. 103-degree difference separated by earth and stone and knowledge that no one else had believed would work. "How much wood have you burned since the storm started?" Hans asked. Thomas consulted his ledger. 6 days. I've fired the heater once per day, sometimes once every 24 hours, sometimes a bit more frequently when the outside temperature drops below 25 below. Total wood consumption is about 130 pounds, just under a quarter cord. Hans did the math in his head. His own household had burned through 3 full cords in 6 days and was still struggling to stay above 40 degrees. Thomas had used less than 10% of that and was comfortable enough to work without gloves in his own home. "We've had 9 people die," Hans said quietly. "The Johansons burned their furniture and are living at the church. Half the county is running out of wood. Martin Sorensen's wife has pneumonia from the cold." Thomas's expression shifted from confused to horrified. "I didn't know. I've been keeping my head down. I didn't realize..." He stopped. "Can people come here? I have space. Not a lot, but some." Anna found her voice. "They won't come. They'll say you're lying about the temperature or that you're using some trick or..." She stopped, angry tears surprising her. "They'll say anything except admit they were wrong." "Then we make them admit it," Hans said, his voice taking on the tone of a man who'd made a decision. "Thomas, you have records, data?" Thomas handed him the ledger. Hans read through 6 days of careful documentation. Outside temperature, inside temperature, wood burned, time stamps. The data was undeniable. "I'm bringing people here," Hans said. "Not to stay necessarily, though we might need that before this is over, but to see, to feel, to have their assumptions shattered the way mine just were." He looked at Thomas. "You built something that works better than anything in this county. People are dying because they don't know what you know. We're going to fix that." He turned to Anna. "Stay here, keep warm. I'm going back to get your mother and brothers, and then we're going to Martin Sorensen's place. He can call the township board, and we're bringing everyone who'll come." Hans left, taking one of the horses and leaving the sled and the other for safety. Anna sat at Thomas's small table and tried to process what she'd just experienced, while Thomas, clearly uncomfortable with company after months of solitude, made tea from spruce needles and melted snow. "I don't want to be right," he said quietly, stirring the pot. "I wanted to be alive. I didn't think about other people dying because no one would listen." "That's not on you," Anna replied. "You tried to explain. They mocked you for it. Doesn't change the fact that I know something that could save lives." The first group arrived 4 hours later. Hans Bergstrom returned with his family, and with Martin Sorensen, and with Carl Johansson, and with Pastor Lindholm from the Methodist Church, and with 5 other men from the township board and farms scattered across the area. They came skeptical and desperate and cold, and they crowded into Thomas's earth shelter like an impossibly large group fitting into an impossibly small space. The warmth hit them like a physical force. Martin Sorensen stopped in the doorway, swaying slightly as his body registered the temperature difference. He walked directly to the thermometer, checked it, walked to the back wall, placed both palms flat against the stone, and then turned to look at Thomas with an expression that contained no apology, but something like broken pride. "Show me how it works," he said. Thomas showed them, explained the principles of thermal mass and earth insulation, and the masonry heater's function, walked them through the physics that his grandfather had understood intuitively, and that modern building practices had abandoned in favor of speed and convention. Showed them his ledger with 6 days of data that proved the concept beyond argument. "How many people could shelter here?" Pastor Lindholm asked. "In an emergency, maybe 10 packed in tight. For actual living, 5 or 6 comfortably." "The Johansons need a place tonight," the pastor said. "They're out of wood and out of furniture to burn. Another night in that house might kill someone." Thomas nodded immediately. "Bring them. I have food, not a lot, but enough to share." Carl Johansson, a quiet man who'd barely spoken since losing his daughter 2 years earlier, walked over to Thomas and shook his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. Martin Sorensen stood by the masonry heater, running his hands over the stonework with something like reverence. "I need to learn how to build this," he said, not quite looking at Thomas. "Not just me, everyone. We need to know how this works before another winter comes and more people die." Over the next 3 weeks, as the temperature slowly climbed from lethal to merely brutal, Thomas Eriksson's earth shelter became something between a refugee center and a classroom. The Johansons moved in that first night, Carl, his wife Margaret, and their 3 surviving children. They slept on the floor wrapped in blankets Thomas provided, and for the first time in 8 days, they weren't cold. The Bergstroms brought food and supplies. Anna came daily, helping Thomas manage the suddenly crowded space and learning the principles of earth-sheltered construction by watching and asking questions. Other families sent their elderly or their sick for a day or two, just long enough to recover from the brutal cold that had invaded their inadequately heated homes. Martin Sorensen came back twice more, not to shelter, but to study. He measured the chamber's dimensions, examined the masonry heater, took notes on the roof structure and the entrance orientation. He asked technical questions that Thomas answered patiently, without resentment, because the point wasn't pride, but survival. "I was wrong," Sorensen said on his 3rd visit, standing outside at the entrance while Thomas shoveled snow. "Not just wrong, stupid. Dangerous. My wife almost died, because I wouldn't consider that maybe conventional wisdom wasn't working." Thomas leaned on his shovel. "Conventional wisdom works until conditions change, Mr. Sorensen. Your way works in normal winters. This wasn't normal." "Your grandfather was Sami?" Sorensen asked. "Partly. He grew up in the far north. He knew cold that makes this look mild. And we mocked you for listening to him instead of listening to us." Sorensen shook his head. "Pass me that shovel. Least I can do is help you dig out." The ice storm finally broke on January 4th, 1937. The temperature climbed to 0, then to 10 above, then to a relatively balmy 20 degrees. Roads became passable, and the county could start assessing damage and casualties. The final death toll for Clearwater County was 17 people, most of them elderly or children, all of them killed by cold in homes that couldn't maintain safe temperatures. Statewide, the storm killed over 100. It would be remembered as one of the worst winter weather events in Minnesota history. But in New Uppsala and the surrounding farms, there was another story spreading alongside the tragedy. The story of a 15-year-old orphan who'd built a shelter that worked when conventional homes failed. The story of 68 degrees maintained with a fraction of the firewood everyone else required. The story of careful observation and traditional knowledge proving more effective than 3 generations of conventional practice. By February, Thomas had taught 12 men how to construct masonry heaters. By March, he'd consulted on the design of 5 new earth-sheltered structures that would be built come spring. The county agricultural extension agent from Duluth came to visit, took measurements and photographs, and wrote a report that would circulate through the University of Minnesota's engineering department. Thomas Eriksson never sought recognition or profit. He taught freely, explaining the principles to anyone who asked. By the winter of 1937-38, Clearwater County had 23 earth-sheltered homes, most of them hybrid designs that combine some traditional above-ground structure with partial earth integration and masonry heaters. Wood consumption dropped by 40% countywide. No one died from cold that winter. By 1940, Thomas had built or consulted on 47 earth-sheltered structures across northern Minnesota. He'd developed a reputation as a quiet, competent builder who understood principles that conventional contractors had forgotten or never learned. He never advertised, never promoted himself, but word spread through communities where winter was a serious enemy and innovation meant survival. Thomas married Anna Bergstrom in 1942. They lived in his original earth shelter for 3 years, comfortable in 96 square feet while saving money. In 1945, they built a larger hybrid home on the same property, partially earth-sheltered with a masonry heater and large south-facing windows for passive solar gain. They raised 2 children there, a son and a daughter, who grew up understanding that effective shelter wasn't about fighting nature, but working with it. Thomas died in 1989 at the age of 68, of heart failure that took him quickly and without much suffering. By then, the techniques he'd demonstrated during that brutal winter had been integrated into earth-sheltered home design across the upper Midwest. His original chambers still stood, modernized with electric lights and a small propane backup heater, but structurally sound and still used occasionally by his grandchildren who visited the property. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church in New Uppsala, and over 300 people attended. Some were old-timers who remembered the ice storm of 1936. Many were people who'd built earth-sheltered homes based on Thomas's principles. Some were strangers who'd read about his story in sustainable housing journals or historical accounts of rural innovation. His grandson Eric delivered the eulogy. "My grandfather was called crazy for building a hole in the ground to survive the winter. People said he'd die, that he was stubborn, that he was arrogant. But he wasn't any of those things. He was just willing to question whether the way things had always been done was actually the best way." He learned from his own grandfather, who learned from ancestors who'd survived 10,000 winters in the far north. And when he proved that knowledge worked, he shared it freely. He never made much money, never became famous, never wrote books or gave lectures. He just lived, built homes, and taught anyone who asked. 17 families sheltered in his first structure during those terrible weeks. Dozens more learned from his example. "Rest now, Grandpa. Old Eric is waiting, and your chamber will hold." Thomas's original earth shelter still stands today, maintained by the Erickson Family Trust as a historical site. Visitors can tour it during summer months, see the masonry heater that burned a fraction of conventional fuel, feel the thick earth walls, read the thermometer records that documented its impossible efficiency. Small plaques mark 3 graves on the hillside above: Thomas Erickson, his wife Anna, and between them, a memorial stone for old Eric, whose knowledge traveled across generations and oceans and saved lives in a land he'd never seen. The ice storm of December 1936 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged, that the way things had always been done was the way they should continue. Thomas Erickson proved that wrong, not with theory, but with a thermometer reading 68 degrees when the outside air was killing people, and with the simple fact of his survival. The principles he used were ancient, developed by the Sami and other Arctic peoples over thousands of years of learning to survive in conditions that would kill the unprepared. Earth-sheltered dwellings have been found in Scandinavia dating back millennia, using the ground's thermal mass as insulation against winter temperatures that dropped far below zero. The Iroquois built longhouses partially underground. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest built entire villages into cliff faces and underground chambers. Modern earth-sheltered home construction has confirmed what Thomas's grandfather knew intuitively. Below the frost line, the earth maintains relatively stable temperatures year-round, providing free thermal mass that dramatically reduces heating and cooling requirements. Thomas succeeded because he was willing to question everything. He had nothing, no money, no tools, no support. But he had observation, patience, and willingness to learn from knowledge that conventional society had dismissed. What the wealthy landowners built quickly and conventionally fell apart or failed when conditions exceeded their design parameters. What a 15-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully still stands nearly a century later. There's a metaphor here about listening to elders, about valuing knowledge that doesn't fit current fashions, about the difference between education and wisdom. Thomas never became famous, never wrote books, never sought recognition. He simply lived, raised his family, and taught when asked. The 47 structures he built directly sheltered over 200 people through decades of harsh winters, providing comfort with a fraction of the resource consumption that conventional homes required. The knowledge he shared influenced hundreds more structures across the upper Midwest and beyond. Most are gone now, replaced by modern construction or simply lost to time. But the knowledge survives, so here's the question for you. What abandoned idea exists in your field? What dismissed approach has everyone written off as old-fashioned or impractical? What might happen if you looked at it the way Thomas looked at earth-sheltered construction? Not as a dead end, but as a beginning. If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about questioning assumptions and learning from traditional knowledge, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through observation, patience, and courage. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't built by fighting nature with brute force. Sometimes it's built by listening to the earth, learning from those who came before, and having the courage to dig deeper when everyone says you're digging your own grave.